all the speakers earlier. Actually, I'm not used to this type of felicitation and all that one. Okay, usually like to be behind the curtains. Okay, so be very, very informal. Okay, similarly, as far as the lectures are also concerned, I'm not going to stick to any particular plan. I can tune to the requirement. I'm encouraging you to ask questions whenever necessary. Okay, we'll try to clarify the points to the best of my abilities. Professor Vasudevan, of course, talked about physics and then mechanics in particular. Mechanics is the mother of all sciences. I totally agree with that one. We are going to restrict ourselves to classical mechanics. So it is a classical subject, it's a core course, it's a foundation course. So many times, as Goldstein tells in the preface to his book, one may get the feeling that this is an archaic subject, you don't really have anything new in it, but because it is a foundation course anyway, you have to go through that one. That is a sort of impression that Goldstein gives. Of course, he says that this is a stepping stone, so if you have to learn various other branches of physics, obviously you should have familiarity with mechanics. But I would say that mechanics is ever increasing in its scope, and there are huge challenges also. Most of the times what is introduced in the first course and even the so-called advanced course is with solvable models. You take simple models which can be solved so that you know everything about it, but the drawback of that method is that you don't get exposed to the difficulties. There are huge challenges. For example, if you take the subject of deterministic chaos, we still do not have the mathematical framework for study of this particular subject. Last century, people were telling this is the subject of the 21st century, but 21st century also nothing has happened so far to have a deep understanding that subject of deterministic chaos. The mathematics that is necessary for learning that subject is yet to be developed. So likewise, there are huge challenges in this particular subject. But that is not the purpose of this particular workshop. I am supposed to introduce Lagrangian mechanics. We all begin our study of classical mechanics essentially with the Newtonian formulation. We start with Newton's equations of motion. Do a lot of things with that one. So one of the questions would be like, why should we learn another technique called the Lagrangian mechanics? And next workshop is going to be on Hamiltonian mechanics. So you start from Newtonian mechanics, then we learn Lagrangian mechanics, then one more thing, Hamiltonian. So why all these things are required? Is it really necessary or not? Okay. So during the course of my lectures, I'll definitely try to give a lot of arguments as to why we should learn Lagrangian mechanics. This is not a reformulation of Newtonian mechanics, even though Newtonian mechanics is contained in the Lagrangian formulation. So let us start by a brief review of Newtonian mechanics. So in Newtonian mechanics, basically, we are concerned with dynamics of point objects as well as rigid bodies. And the basic idea is of the Newton's equations, Newton's laws. Newton has arrived at these laws on the basis of experimental information as well as, of course, contemplation. Okay. We cannot derive the Newton's equations from anything more fundamental. Any effort to derive Newton's equation from simpler concepts has not been successful. So in every theory, when you go on asking what is the basis for a particular law or a particular formulation, you go on getting answers, and at some point you stop the inquiry because you can't proceed beyond that one. Okay. So likewise here, the Newton's laws are just some postulates made by Newton on the basis of experimental information available over a millennia, and especially the work of Galileo and mathematical contemplation. Okay. Essentially, again, I don't want to spend more time on this one, but in case you have questions, of course, we can discuss it further. One is, of course, existence of inertial frames. Essentially, Newton's first law is concerned with existence of inertial frames. These are the frames in which a body not subjected to any force will continue to have rectilinear motion. Only in inertial frames such a thing happens. If you are moving with a rotating frame, you would find that even though we are not applying any external force, the particle does not continue to move in a straight line. So inertial frames are those frames in which the particle will continue to move along a straight line with a uniform velocity in case it is not subjected to any force. That is very much necessary for formulations of Newton's laws. Or I can say inertial frames are those frames in which Newton's laws hold good. Okay. The second is the most important thing, which I will write it in the form of rate of change of momentum equal to the net applied force. Of course, I have written it with one particle. P is the momentum of that particular particle, and F is the total force that is acting on that one. And the rate of change of momentum is equal to the net force acting on that. And the third one, of course, says that if you have got two objects A and B, let us say FAB is the force exerted on B by A. This is equal to minus of the force exerted on A by B. Okay. These are the three laws of Newton. And what we should appreciate from this one is that this is essentially to be complemented with the initial conditions. Let it be one particle or a collection of particles, you need to have two information. One is what is the force acting on that particular object, and other is what is the position and velocity of the object at any particular point of time. So you need to augment these equations with initial conditions. Which means initial position, and initial velocity. So let's say R at time t equal to 0 and P at time t equal to 0. Of course, there is no special importance to 0. What is of importance is that you have to specify it at one particular point of time. Let's say t naught. Then what it says is that using that information to solve this equation, you can predict the future. You can also go backwards and tell what could have been the state at a previous time. So both prediction that is forecasting what is going to happen in future, and retrodiction, that is trying to infer what was the situation in the past. Okay, both are possible. So that means there is a determinism. We will say Newton's equations or Newtonian formulation is deterministic, meaning once you specify the state of the system at a particular point of time, the state at any point of time, both the past as well as the future, is completely decided by this. Okay, this is something which we can tell confidently. Okay. In fact, there is a lot of statement on this one by Laplace, saying that if you know the position of all the objects in the world, and if there is an intelligence which can capture all this, then everything that is going to happen can be predicted without any iota of doubt. Okay. But of course, those who have learned about deterministic chaos, okay, nonlinear dynamics, would know that there is a exaggerated statement. Even though it is theoretically possible, you would find that it is impossible practically to do that one. This again is a problem of studying with toy models or simple models which do not capture all the complexities of the subject. Okay? But nevertheless, as far as we are concerned, at a theoretical level, we would say that Newton's equations are deterministic, meaning that given the initial conditions or given the state of the system at any point of time, it is possible for us to tell the entire history, the whole time history of the system. We can capture everything from that one. You have to differentiate this one with another word which is very important called causality. Causality. What it means is that effects are preceded by cause. That is, for something to happen, there must be a cause. I apply a force, the object moves. I fire the engine of the rocket moves. Okay? So there is a one-way movement in that particular way. So in order that anything happens in this particular universe, okay, according to this particular principle, there must be a cause. Nothing happens without a cause. Okay, this is the central idea of mechanics. Okay, but what I want to tell you here is that as far as these equations are concerned, okay, equations do not really imply this one, because equation tells that if you give our initial conditions and what the force is, we can tell whatever was the situation all the way from the past to the future. Okay. For example, let's say I have a pendulum that is oscillating. I know the position and velocity of the pendulum at a particular point of time. I could have told what the situation was many cycles before that one, right? And what happened in the past, obviously we can't relate to the force that is going to be applied in future. So in that sense, I will say causality as a basic principle is philosophical. We are tailored to think that for anything to happen, there must be a cause. Okay? So I want you to keep this in mind, because when we go to the Lagrangian mechanics, when we go to conservation laws, okay, you will have some difficulty in case you stick to this idea of causality. For example, before proceeding further, let's say you all know that several physical quantities are held constant. These are called conservation laws. Energy of an isolated system is conserved. All of you know this, right? Energy is conserved. If there is no force acting on a system, momentum is conserved. If there is no torque applied, angular momentum is conserved. Now we can ask the question, how does the system know it? How does the system know that it has to move in such a way that these quantities have to be conserved? Is it that it makes several trials and finds it out that it has to move in this particular way? Definitely not. Right? So viewed that way, we can say that this question of causality also needs to be looked at in a much more intricate manner, so that you may have to even revise such thinkings. So for many subjects that way, there is a operative part of that one. That is, you use the formalism of that particular subject to calculate things. For example, in mechanics, we are interested in describing movement of objects around us. What is happening around us? Our day-to-day experience have to be related to physics. That's what we do in mechanics. Okay? So the philosophy may or may not be necessary for some people, but for some of them would like to know what is the very essence of this particular subject. So in that particular case, you don't have to stick to these ideas, you can revise it. Okay? So I'll come back to this now. So this will be the brief summary of Newton's equations. And then of course I will make one more thing here, namely reversible dynamics. Reversible dynamics. That is, there is no irreversibility, there is no friction. So if you look at isolated particle, you would find that our equations of motion are reversible. For example, this particular equation that I have written down, I'm for simplicity taking only one particle problem. This equation we will write as momentum is mass times the velocity, and then our equation becomes m into d square over dt square of r of t equal to f of r. So in concrete form, that's our equation of motion for an isolated particle. Mass into acceleration equal to force acting on it. So in this particular case, suppose you think of a process like this. T going to some t prime, okay, a transformation which let us say is equal to minus t. Then let's say r goes to a new position, then our equation becomes simply m into now you notice that t prime equal to minus t. If you can substitute that one, then this equation becomes simply the equation after doing this transformation and the one which we had been having before are exactly of the same form. So there is no change in the form of the equation. That means the Newton's equations of motion are time reversal invariant. This is the reason why we are able to go both forward and backward in time. Okay. This, of course, I introduce just to tell you that this is against our day-to-day experience. If we have a pendulum set into motion, we find the amplitude of vibration goes on decreasing and eventually the pendulum stops. You look at most of the objects which are set into motion, you find that there is a steady decrease in the amplitude in case it is an oscillatory system, or if it is moving along some particular curve, you would find the speed is decreasing constantly. Eventually, there is a loss of energy from our system and it stops, which means there is a friction at a practical level. Okay? But that friction is because interaction with the environment. So in all those examples, the practical situations where you see that the system is losing energy is one wherein our system is having some coupling with external world. So that means there is an energy transfer from our system to the external world. And because of that one, you find that slowly it looks like the environment is trying to have an upper hand when it comes to the interaction with one subsystem. That is the whole thing. The way to understand is our system is interacting with a big environment there. If you look at the total system, energy is conserved. But when you look at the way the energy transfer is going on, the environment tries to impose its conditions on the subsystem. Okay, it is like a majority winning over minority essentially. Okay, that is, the environment has so many degrees of freedom, and because of that one, the energy of our subsystem essentially has to follow all those degrees of freedom of the environment, and eventually it loses energy in case our system is having larger energy than average energy of the particles in the environment, or if our particle is having lesser energy than the environment, then you will see that our particle is gaining energy. Both are possible. Okay, but this is basically to be represented. For example, if you want to look at a problem of a harmonic oscillator, we would have written something like this: one-dimensional harmonic oscillator, mass into acceleration. We would say this is equal to some minus kx, spring constant into the displacement. This is the ideal harmonic oscillator, this particular part. Okay, this is the force arising from the spring. To this you have to add something like this, a term which is proportional to the velocity. Okay, so this is the effect of the environment. So if you, for example, have a pendulum enclosed in a environment which is inert like a vacuum, you would find that the friction becomes smaller and smaller. Okay, of course you can completely eliminate it, but that goes to show that the friction arises essentially from interaction with the environment. Okay, but what you have to understand is that there is no room for this one at a very basic level. When we talk about isolated particle, there is no room for friction. This comes only when you want to consider our object in contact with the environment. That is something which you have to understand. This is very important when you come to the Lagrangian mechanics, which I am going to do now. Any questions on this one? Because I didn't really want to go too much into the Newtonian mechanics. Are you all following what I am trying to say? Okay. So essentially, one of the cornerstones is like a definition of space and time, which I did not cover. Okay. Then other is existence of inertial frames and the laws of motion. Essentially two laws of motion, the second law and the third law. Okay. And then realize that what we have in Newtonian mechanics is an initial value problem. So specify the state of the system at some point of time. With the help of that one, you can know the entire time history of the system. This is what Newtonian mechanics is all about. Okay. Pardon me? How does friction arise? Okay. This arises, I am saying, because of in words. This is what it is. Okay. So I have, for example, one particular particle, let's say, like a pendulum. So this is set into oscillation. This, let's say, happens in the ambient with the air. So when you consider the pendulum's movement this way in the air molecules environment, you would find that all these air molecules around that one, it will be trying to collide with this particular particle. Okay. So let us take a larger view of that one. Okay. So this will be bombarded by air molecules from all the sides. That is common sense. Okay. Whenever particle hits another particle, there is a momentum transfer. Correct? Now if the particle is static, it doesn't move, then you can say on the average almost the same number of particles are hitting from all sides. So the momentum transfer that this experience would be averaging to 0. Okay? But now imagine that this bob is trying to move in this particular direction. Then you would see that the number of molecules approaching from this side and hitting this one would be more than the ones hitting from the back. So what would be the net effect? You would find a retarding force in this direction. More the speed with which it is moving, trying to move to the forward direction, more will be the force in the negative direction. For example, let's say we are cycling. Okay, you would find a lot of air molecules are there coming and hitting us, and you try to go faster and faster. You find the same environment is trying to exert more and more retarding force for us, right? You would find that retarding force is related to the speed with which you are trying to drive. It will be directly proportional to that. So this is one mechanism. Friction also is a very complicated subject. A lot of details are there. Okay, we can have further discussions on that one maybe during break or something like that. Okay, there are a lot of things there, but those who are interested, I will give you one paper, one reference. This came in Physical Review 1965 or so. You look for this one, Ford, Keck and Mazur. The essential idea will be like this. The essential idea is like, if you have one particle, for simplicity let us take it as one dimension. Let's say m is a mass of that one, and let's say x is its position coordinate, and let's say v, the velocity of that one. I'm using the symbol capital M, capital X, capital V to denote the mass, position and velocity of a particle of our interest. Okay. Now imagine that this is surrounded by a large number of particles. Okay. We'll take it as a collection of harmonic oscillators. So I will have a notation here. I have got a subsystem. This is what is of interest to us. Okay. So this is described by something like this: m into d square x by dt square equal to whatever force we normally think of. Remember, notice that I am not putting a vector sign here because I am considering a one-dimensional problem. This is just for simplicity. Okay. So mass into acceleration of this particular particle to the total force acting on it. This I will divide it into two parts. One is the force directly acting on that one by the other things, like this is charged, you apply an electric field. Or let's say it is having a mass, earth is there, the gravitational pull is there, or all of them can be there. All those forces put together is put here. In addition, I am having a lot of particles here. This is being modeled as a collection of harmonic oscillators. How do you model a collection of harmonic oscillators? Basically something like this. If you have got a jth harmonic oscillator of mass mj, and let's say its position is given by xj, mass into acceleration of the jth oscillator. Obviously this must be equal to minus some spring constant kj into xj and plus something else. That's what I tell you. So if you simply had a collection of harmonic oscillators isolated, this is what is going to be the equation for them. Each particle experiences a restoring force whenever it is displaced from its equilibrium. Okay. But now we have to introduce a coupling between these two things. Okay. And that coupling is expected to be proportional. As far as our big particle is concerned, it is expected to be proportional to displacement of this particle. Okay. So that means it will be something like some proportionality constant c, not the velocity of light, into some x here. And here it will be c into forces from all these harmonic oscillators. Soon when I talk about Lagrangian, I'll put this on in the language of Lagrangian also. Okay. But at the moment, let us take it like this. I think it is fairly easy to appreciate, right? I've got one system. It's subjected to some force F, not because of these particles, but the other causes like electric field, gravitational field, and so on. And then I am saying that there is a force due to these particles also, due to these oscillators, and that is taken to be just proportional to displacement of each one of the oscillators here. Obviously, the contribution from all of them is bound to be there. As far as each one of the oscillator is concerned, this is our standard harmonic oscillator equation, and then this particular system is coupled to that one, so that causes a certain force here. It is symmetric that way. What our particle is trying to do onto each one of the harmonic oscillators, each one of the harmonic oscillators is doing on our system here, symmetrically put in there. So this is that coupling here. Now when you look at this one, something should be very clear to you. If you got a large number of particles, Xj is the displacement of each one of them. This is the sum of all those displacements. Some of the oscillators will be having positive displacement, large value, some of them negative, okay. So when you consider a large collection of such particles, you can expect this sum to be highly fluctuating. Is that point clear? So that means that for all practical purposes, this is the dominant force, but there is going to be some influence of this also. And that's what friction does. Okay? And when you actually solve it, you would find that we get, if you just focus on this one, after doing all that algebra, for certain model of this one, which I will not go into now because it's quite advanced, definitely not today, okay, then you would find that essentially what you have to do is the following. Eliminate the, are you able to see from the back what I am writing? Eliminate the degrees of freedom of the oscillators. So you have to express, you see this equation gives us a hope that we will be able to express all these things, xj's, in terms of this capital X, the degree of freedom that we are interested in. Put that here, you can eventually get an equation involving only that X here. When you do that one, you would find that after the elimination of the variables, we get something like this. Whatever is the original force minus some friction coefficient times dx by dt plus, I will say, some fluctuating force. This is the usual damping that we are looking for. So damping will be produced by that one, and there will be some fluctuating force also. This eta stands for a fluctuating force. That means we are able to provide a mechanism for origin of friction in this particular way. You should view this one as a theoretical example to make a point. If you look carefully, you would find that what I am trying to say is my system here is interacting with all the oscillators simultaneously. That is very difficult for it to happen, right? I put in one particle here, I don't even tell how the other particles are distributed in space. But I say my particle is interacting with all of them simultaneously. That's a bit far-fetched example. But again, this model is developed with an idea of showing that you start with reversible equations and do legitimate mathematical analysis of that equation, and ultimately you can arrive at friction. Something highly non-trivial, okay? One of the first models, 65. Okay? Only very, very few such examples are there in theoretical physics wherein we can exactly solve and say that there is a characteristic difference in the behavior of the system. Remember this? Here we have got a reversible equation. From a reversible equation, this entire system of equation is reversible. Our particle together with the oscillators, this complete system is reversible. But when I focus attention only on the subsystem here, if I follow the mathematics correctly, I am able to produce time reversal invariance broken. Friction can be generated here. So that way it's a highly non-trivial example. But this is too advanced. I just started the lecture there. Okay, since you asked it, I am just trying to tell you that whenever there is a friction, you should understand that at a microscopic level there is no friction. At a microscopic level, when you consider all the agencies involved in our problem, that is, we may be focusing our attention only on one part of it. But remember, there is an environment surrounding that one. So when you consider all of them together, energy is conserved. There is no friction. But when you isolate the behavior of one particle, okay, then you see that it is as if there is a friction. For example, if you are doing statistical mechanics, okay, there is something called equipartitioning of the energy. Equipartition theorem is used for solving problems. It says Whenever you consider a collection of large number of particles, n particles, okay, having some energy there, okay, if n is sufficiently large, once the system equilibrates, you find that every degree of freedom will have an energy, average energy of half kT. K is the Boltzmann constant. You might start with a situation wherein only some of the particles are having energy. But these particles collide with each other, interact with each other, sharing of energy takes place, and eventually you find that on the average, all of them have got the same energy. Okay? So, what is not possible for an isolated particle or just a few particles become possible when you have got a huge collection. Okay? That is what this particular example comes. So, friction that way is within the scope of Newtonian mechanics, but you have to think in terms of a large collection of particles with the mechanism for sharing of energy.